The hush that fell over the gilded crane was deafening. Every sound knife against porcelain, quiet jazz from the corner piano, even the sigh of the air conditioner seemed to freeze mid-air. Waiters stopped mid-step, sensing a shift in gravity they couldn't name. At the center of the storm stood a young waitress, with a bottle of wine clutched in her trembling hands. Her eyes widened, her breath caught. Across the room, three men in tailored suits leaned together, their conversation a low current of Japanese. The silver-haired man at the center whispered with the ease of someone who owned the room. The younger two nodded, one of them hiding a smirk. None of them realized the waitress understood every word. Maya Torres had learned Japanese years ago, long before her life narrowed to split shifts and late-night subway rides. She'd once dreamed of becoming a translator for international conferences. Now she translated between hunger and survival. Tonight she was supposed to pour wine, smile, and disappear. But words, once understood, cannot be unheard. She had caught a lie. Not a harmless one, but a statement that could move markets and ruin honest people. The billionaire Daniel Kaito, the name every finance magazine praised, was twisting facts for his foreign investors, inventing numbers that didn't exist. To the other diners, it was polite conversation. To Maya, it was corruption spoken softly over imported sake. Her heart pounded. She should walk away, pretend she hadn't heard. But something inside her, the stubborn remnant of the student, who once believed language could build bridges, refused to let deceit slide. She glanced around the dining room. Crystal chandeliers glimmered over mahogany tables, the walls lined with gold-trimmed mirrors. Everything in this place was built to make men like him feel untouchable. Kaito laughed, the sound sharp against the hush. He gestured toward the Japanese delegate, his tone dripping arrogance. Maya's pulse quickened as she caught his next sentence. "She's just staff. She won't understand we're lying." The words sliced through her composure. Heat rose in her chest, anger, disbelief, and something more dangerous, clarity. She set the wine bottle down, carefully, almost reverently, as if the stillness of that gesture could balance the chaos in her mind. She took one measured breath. Then, in flawless Japanese, her voice calm and even, she said, "Excuse me, sir, but that's not what he said." Silence expanded like a tidal wave. Every eye turned to her. Kaito froze, his expression faltering for the first time. The investors stared between them, unsure who to believe. Maya didn't flinch. Her hands no longer shook. The world had already drawn its battle lines, truth against power, and she had just spoken the first word. Kaito's eyes narrowed, the easy confidence draining from his face as if someone had flipped a hidden switch inside him. The room seemed to contract around his silence, a vacuum of disbelief pressing in from every direction. The two Japanese businessmen exchanged startled glances, their measured politeness giving way to confusion and suspicion. Maya could feel the weight of the moment settle over her shoulders like wet cloth, but she did not step back. She had already crossed the invisible line between service and defiance, between survival and conscience, and there was no safe return. Kaito straightened slowly, his movements deliberate, each second stretching longer than the last. "You speak Japanese?" he asked, the question soft but edged with threat. Maya held his gaze, her pulse thundering in her ears. "Enough," she said evenly, "to know when someone is being dishonest." Around them, the restaurant's hum had dissolved into total stillness. The pianist had stopped playing mid-note. A wine glass clinked faintly as a nervous guest set it down too hard. Kaito gave a small, humorless laugh, the kind that men like him used to remind the world who held the power. "You must be mistaken," he said. "Perhaps you misunderstood the tone." His voice slid into charm, polished and lethal, but Maya recognized the maneuver for what it was, a performance meant to re-establish dominance. "No," she replied, her voice lower but unwavering. The words were clear. The elder of the two Japanese men spoke for the first time, his English smooth but sharp. "What words did she hear, Mr. Kaito?" he asked. The question hung in the air like a blade. Kaito's smile faltered, his eyes darting toward the waitress, as if willing her to vanish. "It's nothing," he said quickly, "a small misunderstanding." The delegate, however, turned toward Maya. "Miss, could you repeat what you heard?" Maya hesitated for only a breath. "He said," she began, carefully enunciating, "that the numbers in your report were fabricated, that you had agreed to his adjustments." The man's brows lifted, his expression cooling instantly. "That," he said quietly, "is false." For a fleeting second, no one moved. Then, like a current shifting direction, the atmosphere transformed. Chairs scraped, whispers rose, and the illusion of composure shattered. Kaito's jaw tightened. "You've just cost yourself your job," he murmured, leaning closer so only she could hear. "Do you understand that?" Maya felt the tremor of fear at the edge of her resolve, but beneath it burned something fiercer than caution. "Maybe," she said, "but at least I didn't cost someone else their truth." "Oh?" The older delegate gestured to an assistant who pulled out a phone and tapped a few buttons before raising it slightly. A soft sound filled the space, the playback of the dinner conversation, crisp and undeniable. Kaito's own voice echoed through the speakers, repeating the same fabricated figures Maya had translated. There was no escaping it now. The evidence stood in perfect symmetry with her words. A collective gasp rippled through the restaurant. A woman near the bar covered her mouth. A waiter froze mid-stride, his tray trembling. Kaito's skin had gone pale beneath the glow of the chandeliers. "Turn that off," he snapped, but the damage was irreversible. His mask of control cracked visibly, and in that instant, Maya saw the empire behind his name begin to crumble. The delegates stood. One of them gave a short, formal bow to Maya before addressing Kaito in clipped English. "This partnership is terminated effective immediately," he said. "Our company will review legal action." With that, they left the table, their polished shoes clicking across the marble floor like a slow, final drumbeat. Kaito remained seated, staring at the untouched wine, his reflection fractured in the crystal glass. Maya stood still, unsure whether to move or breathe. When he finally looked up, his voice was hoarse, almost human. "You think this makes you a hero?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, just someone who refused to be silent." He said nothing else. The maitre d' pale and trembling approached to escort Maya away, but the eyes of every staff member followed her with quiet awe. For the first time since she had started working there, no one looked through her. She walked toward the kitchen, the echoes of the confrontation trailing her like the fading tail of a storm. Outside, the city pulsed with indifferent light. Maya stepped onto the wet pavement, the scent of rain mixing with the faint perfume of cherry wood from the restaurant's doors. She exhaled for what felt like the first time all night. Somewhere inside, Kaito's name would already be spreading through whispers, phone calls, and breaking news alerts. His empire had been built on deceit, and one sentence spoken calmly in a foreign tongue had set its collapse in motion. As she walked down the street, her reflection shimmered briefly in the windows of passing cars. An ordinary woman, name tag still pinned crookedly to her uniform, carrying no trophies, no triumph. Yet something in her posture had changed. Her back was straighter, her steps deliberate. The city's hum returned, but to her it sounded different now, like the low murmur of a language she had finally mastered, one that spoke of dignity instead of fear, and of truth louder than any lie. Morning light spilled through the narrow blinds of Maya's apartment, carving thin gold lines across the faded walls and the half-empty bookshelf she had carried from place to place for years. The noise of the city seeped in softly distant traffic, a vendor's cart, the hum of someone's radio playing an old jazz tune. She sat at the small table by the window, her uniform folded neatly beside a cup of cooling coffee, and stared at the phone that refused to stop vibrating. Every news alert repeated the same headline: Tech magnate Daniel Kaito, under investigation after leaked audio of fraudulent deal. Each time she saw it, the reality deepened a little more, as if the world were confirming that the impossible had actually happened. The messages from coworkers came next, some in disbelief, others full of gratitude or nervous jokes about quitting before the place shut down. The restaurant's owner had issued a statement calling her a courageous employee who upheld integrity, though Maya suspected the man's real concern was saving face. She switched off the screen, leaning back as the chair creaked beneath her. Outside, sunlight reflected off the glass towers downtown, the very skyline Kaito had once ruled. It shimmered like a broken crown. For the first time in years, she didn't feel small. The thought unsettled her almost as much as it comforted her. She had lived so long inside the invisible rules of obedience, smile, serve, survive, that defiance felt like a borrowed language she wasn't sure she could keep speaking. Yet beneath that uncertainty, there was peace. The truth was out. What came next didn't belong to her. It belonged to justice, to the slow machinery of consequence grinding into motion. Later that afternoon, she walked through Central Park, the wind cool against her face, the world carrying on as if nothing monumental had shifted. People jogged, children chased pigeons, a street musician played a melancholy violin near the fountain. She bought a pretzel and sat on a bench, letting the salt sting her fingers, the simple act of eating grounding her in a life that had suddenly become hers again. Her phone buzzed once more, an email this time, written in formal Japanese. She read the first line twice before understanding it fully. An offer of employment from the very company Kaito had tried to deceive. They wanted her as a cultural liaison and interpreter, citing her remarkable professionalism and moral clarity. The words blurred for a moment as her eyes filled with unexpected tears. She had imagined so many endings to her story: humiliation, dismissal, quiet erasure, but never redemption delivered in the same language that had almost ruined her. She typed her reply carefully, fingers steady, thanking them for their kindness and confirming her acceptance. As the sun began to sink behind the buildings, Maya found herself walking without destination, letting the rhythm of her steps match the steady pulse of the city. Every reflection in the shop windows seemed to carry pieces of her old self. The shy waitress who apologized for everything, the tired teacher scribbling lesson plans between shifts, the girl who once believed that words could change the world. Perhaps, she thought, they still could, if spoken at the right moment and in the right tongue. That night, she returned to the Gilded Crane. The restaurant was quieter now, almost subdued, as if the echo of that frozen evening still haunted its walls. Some guests recognized her and whispered behind their menus. Others offered discreet nods of respect. The maitre d' greeted her with awkward warmth, unsure whether to treat her as staff or symbol. She simply smiled and handed over her resignation letter. "I think it's time I move on," she said. The man nodded, relief and admiration crossing his features in the same breath. Before leaving, she paused in the dining room where everything had begun, the gleam of the chandeliers, the scent of polished wood, the table where power had once spoken and truth had quietly answered. She imagined Kaito sitting there again, rehearsing his next performance, never realizing that a single sentence could unmask him before the entire world. The memory no longer frightened her. It was history now, sealed behind her like a door closing gently in a hallway filled with light. Outside, evening settled over New York in shades of gold and blue. Maya walked toward the subway, her reflection merging with those of strangers rushing home from offices and hotels. They would never know her name, but that didn't matter. Somewhere across the ocean, a team of lawyers and executives was building a new contract, one written honestly this time, its clauses protected by the ripple of one waitress's courage. When she reached the station, the familiar roar of the train echoed through the tunnel like a heartbeat. She stepped inside, gripping the metal pole, and caught her own reflection in the glass. The faint smile, the quiet steadiness in her eyes. She thought of the words she had spoken that night, the sentence that had ended a lie and begun something far greater. Truth, she realized, did not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it entered the world softly, through a calm voice in a quiet room. And when it did, even empires listened. A week later, the city had already turned the scandal into background noise. Another headline drowned beneath the constant churn of finance, gossip, and breaking news. But for Maya, the silence that followed was not emptiness, it was calm. Each morning she woke before dawn, brewed her coffee, and sat by the same window, watching the first train glide past like a silver ribbon in the distance. The quiet no longer felt oppressive. It felt earned, as though the noise of the world had stepped aside to let her breathe. The email from Tokyo arrived just as the sky began to pale. It was formal and beautifully written, addressed to her by name, thanking her again for her integrity during a moment of extraordinary moral pressure. They enclosed a plane ticket, a signed contract, and a note in delicate Japanese script that translated simply to, "The right words spoken at the right time can rebuild trust." Maya read it twice, the corners of her mouth lifting into a small, disbelieving smile. She had imagined redemption as something loud and cinematic, a public applause, but this quiet acknowledgement felt truer, like the language she loved, subtle, precise, powerful without force. Her brother, Javier, nearly dropped his phone when she told him. "You're moving to Japan?" he asked, incredulous and proud all at once. She nodded, still half in disbelief. "Just for a year," she said. "They want help with communication and ethics training. It's surreal." He grinned. Guess those late-night study sessions finally paid off. They laughed together, the kind of easy laughter that only comes after too many years of worry. For the first time, Maya allowed herself to imagine a future that wasn't built on survival alone. Later that day, she returned to the Gilded Crane one last time, not as an employee, but as a visitor saying goodbye. The staff greeted her quietly, their faces soft with admiration and gratitude. The restaurant smelled the same cedar polish, lemon zest, and faint perfume, but something invisible had shifted. Power no longer lingered here. It had been replaced by respect. She walked through the dining room, pausing near the table where everything had begun. The chairs were neatly aligned, the light spilling over the marble surface exactly as it had that night. Yet the air was different, lighter somehow, as if truth had left an imprint that even wealth couldn't erase. The matron approached her with an envelope. "This came for you," he said. Inside was a handwritten note in an elegant, looping script. "You reminded us that silence can also be a language, but you chose not to speak it. Thank you." It was unsigned, but she recognized the penmanship of one of the Japanese investors, the same man who had bowed to her before leaving that night. Maya folded the note carefully and slipped it into her bag, the paper crackling softly like a kept promise. As she stepped outside, a breeze swept through the narrow street, carrying the faint scent of rain and cherry blossom incense from a nearby shop. The city was alive in its usual rhythm, taxicabs honking, footsteps echoing across the wet pavement, but beneath the noise, she heard something new, the steady hum of her own belonging. She was no longer a ghost drifting between tables, no longer defined by the uniform she wore or the orders she obeyed. She had spoken, and the world had listened. In the days that followed, journalists called, eager for interviews and sound bites, but Maya declined them all. "The story isn't about me," she said to one persistent reporter. "It's about truth finding a way out, even when no one is looking." Her words were quoted once, then forgotten amid newer scandals, but that was fine. The point of truth, she had learned, was not permanence, it was impact. The night before her flight, she visited the waterfront, where the East River shimmered beneath the city lights. The skyline rose ahead like a constellation of ambition, glittering, untouchable, and fragile all at once. She thought of Kaito, somewhere in a penthouse stripped of its illusion of control, perhaps realizing that power without honesty was nothing but noise. A faint sadness touched her heart, not out of pity but recognition. He was human too, trapped in a system that rewarded deception until it devoured itself. As the wind carried the scent of salt and steel, Maya whispered into the night, "May you find your own redemption." The words weren't for him alone, they were for everyone who had ever chosen silence over truth, herself included. The city didn't answer, but a distant ferry horn echoed like a benediction. When dawn broke, she was already at the airport, her single suitcase rolling quietly behind her. The terminal buzzed with languages, English, Japanese, Spanish, French, blending into a soft, rhythmic music that filled her with a sense of kinship. She checked her ticket, her heart steady and full. She was not escaping anymore, she was continuing. As she boarded, she glanced one last time at the skyline fading beyond the glass. Somewhere across that horizon lay a new chapter, unwritten but waiting. She thought of that night at the restaurant, the frozen silence, the chandelier's glow, the tremor in her own voice, and smiled. Every empire begins with words, she realized, but sometimes so does its end. And in between those two moments, there will always be someone like her, an ordinary person, standing in the light, speaking softly, and choosing, again and again, to tell the truth. The flight to Tokyo crossed the Pacific beneath a veil of soft clouds, each layer reflecting the sunrise like liquid gold spreading across an endless horizon. Maya sat by the window, her hands folded over the thin airline blanket, watching the light change as the world shifted beneath her. The quiet hum of the engines seemed almost meditative, a steady reminder that she was in motion, leaving behind a city of marble and neon for a country she had once only known through textbooks and films. Every few hours she glanced at the small contract tucked into her bag, the ink still smelling faintly of promise. She wasn't sure what awaited her, but for the first time, uncertainty didn't frighten her. It felt like freedom dressed as possibility. When she landed, Tokyo greeted her with a pale winter sky and the organized chaos of Shibuya Station. The city was alive in a way New York never was, quieter, yet somehow more electric. Neon signs shimmered like constellations. People moved with fluid precision, their paths intersecting and separating with practiced grace. Her new employers had arranged an apartment near the river, small but full of sunlight, with a sliding window that opened to the faint sound of temple bells at dusk. That first evening, as she unpacked, she placed the framed photo of her and Javier on the desk, beside a folded paper crane she had found tucked in the welcome packet. On its wing, someone had written a single word in Japanese: Shinjitsu, truth. The next morning began her first day at the firm. The office occupied the upper floors of a glass tower in Minato, the kind of place where everything gleamed polished wood, quiet elevators, and the soft click of shoes on stone. Her new title read Ethical Liaison and Interpreter, a phrase that still felt too grand for the woman who once balanced trays and whispered apologies. Yet as she stepped through the sliding doors, bowing slightly to each person she passed, she felt something unfamiliar: respect, unforced and sincere. Her fluency was no longer a secret skill hidden behind a uniform, it was her bridge to this new world. Her supervisor, a composed woman named Aki Tanaka, greeted her warmly. "We hope you can help rebuild what was lost," she said. "Trust takes longer to translate than language." Maya smiled, understanding more than the words. For weeks, she worked quietly, assisting in negotiations, clarifying cultural nuances, and ensuring that honesty guided every line of every contract. The staff began to speak of her not just as the woman who exposed Kaito, but as the interpreter who listens like she can hear the air breathe. Yet beneath the calm surface of her new life, she felt the faint ripple of something darker. Kaito's name returned to the news in fragments, rumors of court hearings, stock collapses, accusations of bribery stretching across continents. At first, she ignored the stories, focusing instead on her work. But one afternoon, while reviewing documents, she noticed a familiar signature embedded deep within a list of subsidiary investors: Kaito Holdings, Restoration Fund. It seemed he was trying to rebuild, using proxies and shell companies. She stared at the name for a long time, the paper trembling slightly in her hands. That night, she walked along the Sumida River, the reflection of city lights rippling against the current. She thought about the strange cycle of human ambition, how even after falling, some men tried to stand on the ruins of their own deception. She wondered if her silence now would make her complicit, if truth demanded vigilance beyond a single act of courage. As the wind lifted her hair, she whispered to the dark water, "Maybe redemption isn't rebuilding what you lost, but admitting what you destroyed." A few days later, she requested a private meeting with Aki. The room was minimalist, the air faintly scented with green tea. "There's something you should see," Maya said, sliding the document forward. "I think Mr. Kaito is trying to re-enter through this network." Aki read in silence, her brow tightening slightly. When she looked up, her expression held quiet approval. "You could have ignored this," she said. "Most would have." Maya shrugged. "I didn't come here to be most people." The company acted swiftly, forwarding the findings to regulators. Within weeks, international media picked up the story again. Disgraced CEO caught in attempted corporate return. The revelation was smaller this time, less sensational but far more final. Kaito's empire was finished, its last lifeline severed by the same woman who had first spoken against him. Months passed, and spring arrived in a slow unfurling of cherry blossoms along the riverbanks. Maya often sat beneath the trees during lunch breaks, watching petals drift across the water like fragments of unspoken prayers. She no longer carried bitterness toward Kaito. What remained was a calm acknowledgement that truth had run its full course. In the distance, temple bells marked the hour, each chime gentle and absolute. One evening, after finishing a late translation session, Maya received an envelope at her desk. The handwriting was unfamiliar, elegant, and restrained. Inside was a short letter, unsigned, written in English. "Thank you for ending what I could not stop myself from becoming. I hope you continue to use your voice for those who cannot." There was no doubt who had sent it. She read it once, then folded it carefully, placing it beside the paper crane on her desk. The city lights outside shimmered like stars scattered across glass. In that quiet office, surrounded by the faint hum of computers and the distant murmur of Tokyo below, Maya realized that her story had never been about punishment. It had always been about consequence, the kind that ripples outward, reshaping the world in small, invisible ways. Truth had destroyed an empire, yes, but it had also built something new. A bridge between languages, a career born from integrity, and a woman who finally believed her own voice was enough. When she left the building that night, the streets glowed with lantern light, and somewhere nearby, someone was laughing in Japanese, a sound soft, human, and infinitely alive. Maya smiled, slipping her hands into her coat pockets as she walked toward the train station. For once, she didn't feel like a passenger in someone else's story. The world moved around her, vast and unpredictable, but every step she took spoke one simple truth. The smallest voice, when steady and sincere, could still shake the walls of power and leave them standing cleaner than before. Spring melted gradually into the soft warmth of early summer, and Tokyo began to shimmer beneath long days of silver light and slow evenings that smelled faintly of jasmine and street food smoke. Maya had settled into her life there with an ease that surprised her, the rhythm of her work blending quietly with the rhythm of the city. Each morning she walked the same path along the river, past paper lantern cafes and the murmuring sound of bicycles gliding over cobblestones, and each evening she watched the sky turn amber behind the skyscrapers, their mirrored windows catching fire before dusk swallowed them whole. The simplicity of it grounded her. The small gestures of politeness, the unspoken harmony of shared space, the language that wrapped itself around her thoughts until she began to dream in Japanese. Her days at the firm grew longer but more purposeful. Clients from abroad requested her by name, seeking the calm precision she carried into every negotiation. She no longer hesitated when switching between languages. Her voice, once careful and cautious, now carried weight. In conference rooms lined with glass, she could feel the subtle shift in energy when she spoke, the quiet recognition that power could also reside in patience. There were moments when she remembered the gilded crane and the trembling girl holding a wine bottle, but the image felt distant, like a scene from a film she had watched years ago and only half believed was real. One evening, as she left the office, she passed a television in the lobby broadcasting international news. Kaito's name appeared again, but this time it was not a headline of disgrace, it was an obituary. The report was brief. The former CEO had been found dead in his coastal estate. The cause ruled as natural but shrouded in quiet speculation. The announcer's tone was solemn, respectful, and entirely detached. Maya stood there for a moment, her reflection merging with the screen, unable to decide what she felt. There was no satisfaction, no vindication, only the faint ache of understanding that every empire ends not with a roar, but a whisper. She turned off the television and stepped into the night, the city pulsing around her like a living heart that never stopped beating. For the next few weeks, she carried that news with her like a secret she didn't know where to place. It hovered at the edge of her thoughts as she translated contracts, corrected reports, and prepared for meetings, a quiet reminder of how fragile power could be when it was untethered from truth. Eventually, she took a weekend trip to Kamakura, drawn by the need for stillness. The sea stretched before her, vast and endless, its surface reflecting the slow dance of clouds. She sat near a shrine overlooking the water, the wind brushing strands of hair across her face, and thought about Kaito not as the man who had humiliated her, nor the symbol of greed the media had made him, but as a human being lost inside the machinery of his own ambition. "I hope you found peace," she murmured, the words dissolving into the sound of waves. When she returned to Tokyo, an envelope awaited her on her desk. It bore the seal of the same law firm she had once helped expose, but the letter inside was from a different hand, Kaito's former legal counsel. The message was simple. Before his death, Kaito had instructed that a donation be made anonymously to a language scholarship fund under her name, designated for students who could not afford tuition. The amount was substantial, enough to change lives. She read the letter twice, her vision blurring slightly as she imagined students decades from now speaking new languages, crossing new bridges built from the fragments of his remorse. Redemption, she realized, was not always clean. Sometimes it arrived through the same hands that had once caused harm. Over time, the story faded from public memory, but in quiet corners of the corporate world, people still mentioned the waitress who had corrected a billionaire in flawless Japanese. The tale had taken on a mythic quality. A whisper of courage passed between assistants and interns, who dared to dream of integrity in a world obsessed with success. Maya never corrected the details. She simply smiled when she heard her own legend echoing back through unfamiliar voices. As summer deepened, her brother came to visit. They walked together through Ino Park, where the lotus ponds shimmered like sheets of green glass. Javier listened as she told him about her work, her students, and the city's strange serenity. "You look happy," he said finally. "Not just peaceful, actually happy." Maya laughed softly, the sound blending with the distant chatter of children chasing pigeons. "I think happiness is quieter than people expect," she said. "It feels like understanding instead of excitement." That evening they stood on a pedestrian bridge overlooking the glittering expanse of Tokyo. The lights stretched endlessly, a mosaic of motion and memory. "Do you ever miss New York?" Javier asked. She considered it for a long moment. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but not the person I was there. She was surviving. I'm living now." Her brother smiled, resting an arm over her shoulder. "Then I'd say you're right where you belong." When he left 2 days later, Maya lingered at the airport long after his flight had taken off, watching planes lift into the pink haze of sunset. Somewhere in that upward movement, she felt the symmetry of her own journey, the rise after the fall, the grace found in humility, the quiet permanence of truth. She returned home through the glowing city streets, her reflection gliding alongside hers in every shop window, not as a shadow but as a companion. That night, before sleeping, she opened the window of her apartment. The city hummed below, alive and endless, and the scent of rain carried through the summer air. On her desk, the paper crane still sat beside Kaito's letter, its delicate wings catching the lamplight. She reached out and turned it gently between her fingers, whispering the word written on its wing, Shinjitsu. The syllables felt sacred, a reminder that language, when spoken with honesty, could outlast even the loudest empire. Then she blew softly, and the crane's wings stirred as if ready to take flight, carrying with it the final breath of a story that had begun in silence and ended in peace. Autumn arrived quietly, slipping into the city without ceremony, painting Tokyo in shades of rust and honeyed gold. The leaves gathered in neat spirals along the sidewalks, caught in small gusts that danced between cafes and train platforms, whispering against the ankles of strangers. Maya walked through it all with a calm that felt new, her steps unhurried, her gaze lifted toward the sky that always seemed to shift between silver and rose at twilight. Months had passed since Kaito's death, and the world had moved on, as it always did, but she had not stopped thinking about the strange gravity of forgiveness, the way it tethered her to the very things she wished to leave behind. Her work had expanded beyond translation now. She'd begun mentoring younger interpreters, teaching them not only how to bridge words, but how to bridge intention. "Language isn't just sound," she told them one evening after class, as the office lights dimmed around them. "It's responsibility. You can make truth clear or make lies comfortable. Every sentence asks you to choose." The students listened closely, their notebooks open, their pens motionless. Some nodded, others only stared, sensing that what she was offering was not technique, but something closer to faith. One afternoon, her supervisor called her into a meeting. The firm had been invited to participate in an international ethics summit in Geneva, and they wanted Maya to represent them as both a speaker and a panel interpreter. The invitation stunned her. It felt impossibly far from the woman who once apologized for existing in her own workplace. Yet when she looked at the printed letterhead, embossed with gold lettering, and her own name beneath the company seal, she felt something steady settle in her chest. "I'll go," she said simply. The weeks leading up to the summit passed in a blur of preparation. She spent long nights refining her presentation, outlining the story of transparency through cultural empathy, weaving her own experience into broader lessons about corporate integrity. She never mentioned Kaito by name, but his presence lived between the lines, an unnamed ghost of arrogance turned catalyst for change. When she rehearsed her speech, she practiced the pauses carefully, ensuring that silence carried as much weight as words. When the day arrived, Geneva greeted her with crisp air and a lake that gleamed like liquid glass. The conference hall overlooked the water, its windows towering, the light diffused and clear. Delegates filled the room, their earpieces gleaming, the air humming with quiet anticipation. As she took the stage, her palms were cool rather than shaking. The microphone caught her breath for a brief second before she began. "Every empire," she said, her voice calm and measured, "is built on words, promises, contracts, speeches, negotiations. But words are fragile. They can illuminate or they can deceive. And when deception becomes fluent, it becomes dangerous." The room was utterly still. She spoke of the unseen power of small truths, the courage it takes to confront dishonesty not with anger, but with clarity. "The human voice," she continued, "is not meant to shout over corruption, it is meant to steady it into silence." When she finished, the applause was not thunderous, but it was long and genuine. Delegates from half a dozen countries came to speak with her afterward, their expressions thoughtful, their questions sincere. A representative from the United Nations asked for a copy of her paper. Another from a tech foundation invited her to consult on ethical training programs. Yet what stayed with her most was a quiet thank you from a young intern who said, in halting English, "Your story made me believe small people can change big rooms." Maya smiled and replied softly, "They already do. Every day." That evening, she walked alone through the narrow streets near the lake, her heels clicking softly against cobblestone. The air carried the faint scent of rain and burning wood from nearby cafes. She passed a violinist playing under an archway, the melody so pure that it seemed to gather the night around it like silk. For a moment, she closed her eyes, letting the music blur with the memory of another silence, the one that had frozen an entire restaurant years ago. But this silence was different. It was peaceful, like an echo that had finally found its way home. When she returned to her hotel, she found an envelope slipped under her door. There was no name, only a seal she didn't recognize. Inside was a handwritten note in Japanese. "Truth, once spoken, does not vanish. It travels. You have sent it far." Beneath the note was a simple pressed cherry blossom, fragile yet perfectly preserved. She didn't know who had sent it, perhaps someone who had heard her speech, perhaps someone who had once read about her story. It didn't matter. She placed it between the pages of her journal, smiling at the thought that even distant strangers could carry fragments of her voice. The next morning, before flying back to Tokyo, she stood by the lake as mist rose from the water's surface. The air was cold enough to sting her lungs, yet she felt utterly awake. She realized that the story that had once defined her no longer belonged solely to her. It had grown, evolved, crossed oceans and languages, becoming something larger, a quiet movement toward honesty that others could inherit. When her plane ascended above the clouds, sunlight broke through in blinding gold, scattering across the wing. She closed her eyes, feeling the vibration of the engines beneath her, steady and sure. Somewhere between earth and sky, she understood the simplest truth of all, that every act of courage, no matter how small, leaves behind a soundless echo, one that lingers in hearts, travels through generations, and reminds the world that integrity, like language, is a living thing. As Tokyo reappeared below her hours later, its light spreading like veins of fire through the dusk, Maya smiled. She thought of the paper crane waiting on her desk, the word Shinjitsu still written on its wing, and she whispered to herself, "The truth keeps flying." The city met her with open arms, and she stepped once more into the rhythm of its heartbeat, unafraid, unhidden, and utterly free. The months following the summit unfolded like a long exhale, each day carrying a new kind of stillness that Maya had never known before. Her work multiplied, her reputation deepened, and yet the world seemed to slow for her, as though time itself had adjusted to the rhythm of her restraint. Letters arrived from students, journalists, and quiet strangers who had heard her story and wanted to thank her for reminding them that truth, though often inconvenient, could still be graceful. She replied to each one with sincerity, always choosing her words carefully, understanding now that language could heal as easily as it could wound. Tokyo moved through late autumn with deliberate beauty, the air tinged with wood smoke and the metallic scent of oncoming rain. The river mirrored the city's glow each evening, a slow-moving ribbon of light that seemed to carry the memories of every face reflected in it. On weekends, Maya would walk along its banks, her coat buttoned against the wind, watching the lanterns drift downstream during the seasonal festivals. Each tiny flame, she thought, was a confession, the city's way of releasing what it could not say aloud. Her life was simple but not small. The firm had expanded its ethical division under her quiet leadership, and she now oversaw a team of translators and advisors who viewed her less as a superior and more as a compass. In every meeting she insisted that precision was not the same as honesty. Translation, she told them, isn't just about carrying words across borders. It's about carrying accountability. Her presence brought a calm authority that even the most seasoned executives respected. Yet, despite her growing stature, she never forgot the taste of humiliation or the chill of fear from that night at the Gilded Crane. Those memories had become her anchor, reminders of who she was before the applause, before the redemption, before truth had chosen her as its vessel. One evening, as she reviewed documents in her apartment, her phone buzzed with a message from Javier. He had sent a photo, their old neighborhood in New York, bathed in orange light, children playing on cracked sidewalks just as they once had. They repainted Mom's old diner, he wrote. They named it the Honest Spoon. Thought you'd like that. She laughed softly, the sound catching in her throat. For the first time in years, she felt the distance between who she had been and who she had become close like a completed circle. Later that night, a light rain began to fall, soft enough to sound like whispers on the window pane. She poured tea and opened her journal, the same one that still held the pressed cherry blossom from Geneva. Turning the fragile pages, she wrote slowly, not about Kaito or the scandal or the summit, but about the quieter lessons that had emerged afterward, the patience of truth, the humility of forgiveness, the weight of words spoken with kindness. Her handwriting had changed. It flowed more confidently now, like water tracing its own course. A few weeks later, The company received an invitation to collaborate with the Ministry of Education on a national ethics and language initiative. The project aimed to teach students the connection between clarity of speech and moral responsibility, a concept Maya had been advocating for years. When she presented her proposal to the committee, she began not with statistics or corporate values, but with a simple story. "Once," she said, "I was a waitress who overheard a lie, and because I understood the words, I could no longer stay silent." The room fell into the kind of silence she recognized, the attentive stillness that comes when truth touches something dormant in people's hearts. The program was approved within the month. Schools across Japan began incorporating new lessons on intercultural ethics, and Maya's team produced a series of short films illustrating how honesty could dissolve barriers of class, race, and power. Her voice narrated one of them, its tone measured and warm. To listen deeply is to see clearly. To speak with integrity is to build what cannot be destroyed. When the video went viral online, the comments came in dozens of languages, proof that the message had traveled far beyond the borders of translation. Yet amid the recognition, Maya remained private. She declined television interviews, rarely accepted awards, and preferred to stay close to her quiet apartment overlooking the river. She often said that truth was not a performance, it was a practice. On late evenings, she would stand by her window, watching the city lights blur against the drifting mist, thinking of all the voices she had helped uncover, the ones too afraid to speak until they heard her story. The thought comforted her. Courage, she realized, was contagious, and hers had multiplied in the lives of others. One December morning, as the first snow began to fall, she received an invitation from a university in Kyoto to deliver a guest lecture on ethics and language in the global age. The invitation was handwritten, sealed with a red wax crest, and signed by a professor she had once met at the summit. The timing felt right. She accepted. A week later, standing before a room full of students, she began her lecture without notes, speaking from the memory of her own transformation. "The world will always reward the loud," she said, "but progress belongs to the careful listener. If you understand someone's words, you understand their soul, and when you understand, you are responsible." The students listened as though the air itself were holding its breath. When she finished, one young woman approached her, eyes bright with gratitude. "How did you find the courage to speak that night?" she asked. Maya smiled, considering the question carefully before answering. "I didn't find it," she said. "It found me when silence became heavier than fear." That evening, as she boarded the train back to Tokyo, the landscape blurred into silver and green outside her window. She thought of the long path that had brought her here, the fragile girl, the trembling voice, the moment of defiance that had rippled into 1,000 unseen changes. The truth, she knew now, didn't belong to any one moment. It was a current that carried her forward, quietly and endlessly. And as the train sped toward the city's glow, she closed her eyes and whispered, almost to herself, "Keep going." Winter settled over Tokyo like a soft blanket of smoke and silver, covering rooftops and riverbanks in a quiet kind of stillness that made the city sound as if it were holding its breath. The neon signs flickered against the low clouds, their reflections stretching along puddled streets, and the wind carried the faint smell of roasted chestnuts from vendors who stood shivering under small umbrellas. For Maya, the season brought a rhythm of solitude. She welcomed the calm after years of movement, the pause that lets a story find its ending. Her lectures had grown popular across the country, her work praised in newspapers and academic circles alike, yet she kept her life small, rooted in ritual and silence. Most mornings began with tea and translation. She still woke before dawn, long before the city stirred, sitting at her desk while the first hints of daylight turned the horizon pale gold. The habit was less about discipline now and more about gratitude, a way to remind herself that she had once fought for the right to begin again. On her desk sat the paper crane, slightly faded from the years but still perfectly folded, its inked wing reading Shinjitsu. Sometimes she touched it lightly with her fingertip before writing, as though drawing strength from the memory it carried. Her apartment overlooked the Sumida River, and from her window she could see the lights of passing trains flicker like brief constellations against the mist. She often thought about the countless lives moving through those trains, people carrying their own secrets, their own small acts of courage or silence. The thought humbled her. She was no longer interested in being remembered. She wanted to be useful, to help truth flow through others as it once flowed through her. One evening, while reviewing a new manuscript for publication, she received a message from an unfamiliar address. The subject line was written in Japanese characters she instantly recognized for their formality. Regarding the Kaito Foundation. Her breath caught slightly. She clicked it open. The message explained that Kaito's former company, after years of restructuring and court-mandated reforms, had created a nonprofit division dedicated to corporate transparency and language accessibility. They wanted her to serve as an honorary advisor, a gesture. They wrote, "To close the circle and honor the one who opened it." Maya read the email twice, her pulse steady but her mind turning slowly. It felt strange. The idea that an empire once built on deception now sought redemption through her. She considered declining. Part of her feared the association, the reopening of a wound she had long let heal, but another part understood that refusing would deny the possibility of change she had always believed in. She typed a short reply. "If sincerity guides the mission, I accept." When she hit send, a wave of quiet certainty passed through her. Redemption, she realized, could belong to more than one person. Weeks later, she attended the Foundation's inauguration ceremony, held in a glass atrium overlooking the Tokyo skyline. The air buzzed with cautious optimism. Journalists whispered. Executives smiled too widely, and cameras flashed like restless stars. Maya stood slightly apart, observing. When her name was announced, the room fell into an expectant hush. She walked to the podium, her posture calm, her voice steady. "Reform," she began, "does not erase the past. It acknowledges it and then insists on doing better. Tonight is not an apology. It is a beginning." Her words echoed through the hall, quiet but deliberate, carrying the weight of conviction that no scandal, no power, no death could ever undo. After the ceremony, a young man approached her. He introduced himself as Kaito's former assistant, barely 30, his suit too large for his frame. "He spoke about you often before he passed," he said, his tone respectful but unsure. "He said you reminded him of the person he wanted to be before success drowned him." Maya looked at him for a long moment, sensing both truth and longing in his eyes. "Then make sure his legacy finds that person again," she said gently. "Start from honesty. Build from there." The man nodded, his expression shifting from guilt to something resembling resolve. That night, as she left the building, snow began to fall. It drifted soundlessly over the city, settling on her coat, her hair, her hands. The streets glowed beneath street lamps, their light bending through the flurries like golden threads. Maya walked slowly toward the station, each step leaving a faint imprint that vanished seconds later under fresh snow. There was something perfect in that impermanence, the way life allowed for endings that didn't require erasure, only grace. On the train ride home, she gazed out the window, her reflection superimposed on the blur of lights and white sky. For the first time, she thought of Kaito without bitterness or pity, only acceptance. His story had folded into hers like a second language, learned through pain but remembered through compassion. The train hummed along the tracks, a sound steady and rhythmic, like breath. When she reached her apartment, the city was almost silent, the snowfall thick enough to mute even the sirens and car horns. She opened the window slightly, letting the cold air spill in. The crane on her desk stirred in the breeze, its shadow flickering softly against the wall. She picked it up, holding it to the light, and whispered, "You were right, old friend. Truth travels." Then she placed it back beside her notebook, sat down, and began to write not about lies or redemption or the ghosts of power, but about the ordinary courage of those who choose honesty in moments that will never make the news. Her sentences flowed long and measured, each one carrying the quiet conviction that stories, once told with sincerity, could live forever in the unseen corners of the world. Outside, the snow kept falling, erasing footprints but not memory, and somewhere within that endless whiteness she felt the faint, steady pulse of peace. The first dawn of a new year broke across Tokyo like a slow unfolding of light, tender and deliberate, washing the city in pale gold that seemed to hum against the silence left behind by the celebrations of the night before. From her apartment window, Maya watched the skyline stretch awake trains, beginning their slow crawl across bridges, the river carrying thin sheets of mist that curled upward like threads of breath. She stood with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, the warmth seeping into her fingers, and felt the rare stillness of a morning that carried no urgency, no expectation, only the steady rhythm of continuation. The year ahead waited quietly, unshaped and full of mercy. The Kaito Foundation's work had begun to expand across borders, and though her title remained honorary, Maya had become its voice of conscience. Reports came weekly from new chapters forming in Singapore, Berlin, and Sao Paulo, each built around the same principle she had once whispered in defiance. Truth is the only language that never loses meaning in translation. Reading those reports filled her with a sense of wonder she could barely articulate. What had started as a single act of courage, spoken almost by instinct, had rippled outward into a movement. Yet she never saw it as hers alone. It belonged to everyone who had ever refused to be silent in the presence of deceit. Her days had settled into a pattern that felt both grounded and luminous. She taught twice a week at the university, alternating between ethics seminars and practical translation workshops. Her students adored her, though she never tried to be adored. She spoke to them the way she wished someone had once spoken to her, without condescension, without pretense, just truth wrapped in gentleness. Sometimes she would pause mid-lecture, gazing out the window at the slow swirl of snow, and think of how language could be as fragile as those flakes, each unique, melting upon contact yet somehow infinite in number. One afternoon after class, she found herself approached by an elderly professor who had attended her Geneva lecture years earlier. His hands trembled slightly as he offered her a bound manuscript. "It's a collection," he said, "on truth and cultural memory. Your story belongs here." Inside were essays written by scholars and philosophers, and nestled among them was one titled "The Waitress Who Spoke the Language of Integrity." Maya turned the pages slowly, half smiling, half stunned by the permanence of print. "You've turned a moment into mythology," she said softly, and the man chuckled. "No, my dear," he replied. "You turned it into history." That night, she carried the manuscript home through falling snow. The city lights shimmered against the white air, and she felt the peculiar ache that came with recognizing her own smallness amid something vast and enduring. She had not sought legacy, yet it had found her, shaped not by fame, but by the accumulation of quiet choices every moment she had chosen, empathy over anger, understanding over pride. The realization humbled her. It reminded her that truth did not need witnesses to be real. It needed only courage to begin. Later, she sat by her window again, the manuscript resting beside her tea. The crane still kept its place on the desk, faded now to a soft ivory, its creases delicate from time. She thought of unfolding it, smoothing its wings flat to see if the inked word Shinjitsu had blurred, but decided against it. Some things, she knew, were meant to remain folded to carry mystery, to remind the heart that not all truths need to be open to be understood. As the hours slipped into night, her phone buzzed with a video message from Javier. He was sitting in the small diner in New York, the one renamed the Honest Spoon, and behind him the walls were filled with framed photographs of people from their old neighborhood. "They started a community scholarship," he said, his grin wide. "Guess whose name it carries?" In the background, someone had painted a mural of a woman holding a tray, a tiny paper crane hovering above her hand. Maya laughed, her eyes stinging with warmth she hadn't expected. The past, it seemed, had found its own gentle way of saying, "Thank you." Weeks passed, and winter softened. The Foundation's first international conference was announced to take place in Kyoto that spring, and they asked her to deliver the closing address. The theme was rebuilding trust through language. As she wrote her speech, she felt no need for grandeur. She wrote simply, clearly, each sentence flowing like water over smooth stone. She spoke not of Kaito, nor of herself, but of the nameless people who listen, translate, and bridge worlds every day without recognition. They are the architects of truth, she wrote, quiet builders of the invisible roads that keep humanity from collapsing under its own noise. Aye. When the day arrived, the conference hall was filled with diplomats, students, and ordinary citizens. Maya stood before them, calm as the morning she had watched from her window. Words, she began, can build or destroy, but they will always reveal who we are. Power changes language, only kindness preserves it. The hall was utterly silent. Truth, she continued, does not demand applause. It asks only to be heard, and once heard, it never dies. When she finished, there was a pause, a breath suspended between speaker and audience before the applause began. Not loud, but rhythmic, like the pulse of something living. For a moment she closed her eyes, feeling it wash over her, not as validation but as connection. Every voice in that room seemed to echo her own, reminding her that honesty, once spoken, multiplied in the hearts of others. That evening she returned to the river. The cherry trees were just beginning to bloom, their petals drifting across the water like quiet promises. She sat on a low stone wall, the air cool and fragrant, and whispered into the twilight, "It was never about ending an empire. It was about beginning again." The wind carried her words away, scattering them like petals over the city that had become her home. As darkness settled, she stood and began to walk, her footsteps light against the cobblestones. Behind her, the river shimmered beneath the lanterns, endless and patient. The truth had found its course long ago, and she had simply followed it. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang softly, marking the hour. And Maya smiled, knowing that even if the world forgot her name, the language of integrity she had spoken would keep traveling quietly, endlessly, like light across water. Spring deepened into full bloom, and Kyoto became a living painting temples framed by cascades of pink petals, rivers turning to ribbons of reflected sky, the air filled with that soft fragrance of renewal that made even strangers smile as they passed. Maya stayed in the city after the conference, choosing to linger a few days longer, as though her heart needed time to absorb what her mind already knew, that her story, once so intimate, had become part of something larger than herself. Each morning she walked through the philosopher's path, her shoes crunching lightly over fallen blossoms, and each evening she returned to her small guest house overlooking a bamboo garden, listening to the wind whisper through the leaves. The days felt suspended, tender and unfinished, like a sentence waiting for its final word. Letters continued to arrive from around the world, carried by students, journalists, and ordinary people who had found strength in her quiet defiance. Some wrote about workplace injustices they had confronted, others about secrets they had finally spoken aloud after years of fear. Maya read every letter carefully, her eyes soft with recognition, realizing that truth had become a chain of voices stretching farther than she could ever see. "It travels," she murmured once, repeating the same word she had whispered to the paper crane so long ago. And it did, through languages, across oceans, in the hearts of people who would never meet but somehow still understood each other perfectly. On her last evening in Kyoto, the university organized a small dinner to thank her for her contribution. The event was modest, long tables under string lights, bowls of steaming ramen, laughter echoing under the night sky, but to Maya it felt sacred. Students crowded around her, eager to share their plans, their fears, their hopes for the world. She listened with patient attention, responding not as an icon but as a teacher who still remembered what it felt like to be uncertain. When one shy student asked, "Do you think the truth can survive in a world that rewards lies?" Maya smiled and said, "Truth doesn't need to win to survive. It only needs to be spoken." The group fell silent, the words settling over them like dusts of gold. Later, when the guests had gone and the lanterns flickered low, she remained behind to help the staff tidy up. A professor approached, holding an envelope sealed with the university's crest. "This came earlier," he said. "It's from the Board of Trustees." Inside was an official letter offering her a permanent position as the head of a new program, Global Communication Ethics. They wanted her to build it from the ground up, to train a generation of interpreters and diplomats who could carry empathy as fluently as they carried speech. The offer was generous and unexpected. For a moment, Maya said nothing. The garden shimmered under lantern light, and she could hear the faint sound of rain beginning to fall on the wooden deck. She finally looked up, her eyes reflecting the glow. "Tell them," she said softly. "I'd be honored." That night she couldn't sleep. The rain turned steady, drumming against the roof like a lullaby. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the long path that had brought her here from a trembling waitress in New York to a lecturer in Kyoto, entrusted with shaping minds. The contrast felt almost unreal. She turned on the bedside lamp, reached for her journal, and began to write. Her handwriting was slow, deliberate. "I used to think truth was a weapon," she wrote. "Now I know it's a seed. You plant it once, and even if you never see it grow, it finds its way to the light." When morning came, the city was washed clean by rain. The air smelled of wet earth and cherry bark, and sunlight caught on every droplet still clinging to the trees. Maya walked to the nearest temple, the one she passed every morning, carrying a small offering of incense. She lit the stick carefully, watching the smoke spiral upward in soft gray threads. For a long moment, she closed her eyes and breathed deeply. The stillness around her was complete, the kind of silence that doesn't demand attention but invites gratitude. She thought again of Kaito, no longer with anger or even pity, but with a quiet acknowledgement that his story had led her here. Every consequence, every humiliation, every breathless moment of fear had been part of a design she could not see at the time. Redemption, she understood now, was not an ending. It was a continuation, a bridge built between failure and forgiveness. She smiled faintly and whispered into the air, "Thank you for the lesson." The smoke drifted upward and disappeared into the blue. That afternoon she visited a calligrapher's studio near the old market. The man was elderly, his hands steady as stone, his brush movements precise. "What words shall I write?" he asked. Maya paused for a long time before answering. "Shinjitsu," she said, her voice soft but certain. The man nodded and dipped his brush into ink, his movements slow, reverent. When he handed her the finished scroll, the black strokes gleamed like polished metal against the white paper. She bowed deeply, feeling the weight of the moment settle inside her chest like a quiet flame. As evening descended, she took the train back to Tokyo. Through the window, the countryside unfurled in waves of green and silver, villages flickering past like memories half remembered. The hum of the rails lulled her into reflection. The world outside seemed to move at the same pace as her thoughts, steady, purposeful, endless. When the city lights appeared again on the horizon, she felt no rush, no anticipation, only peace. At home, she hung the calligraphy on her wall, right above the desk where the paper crane still rested. The inked words seemed to glow faintly in the lamplight, its meaning eternal and familiar. She traced the air above it with her hand and whispered, "We're still flying, aren't we?" Then she sat down to write the outline for her first lecture as head of the new program. Her pen moved smoothly, each line of thought flowing into the next, guided by the same principle that had saved her life so many years ago: speak truthfully, listen completely, and let compassion be the language that endures. Outside, the wind carried the scent of blooming cherry trees, and Maya felt once again the quiet pulse of something infinite, the certainty that truth, once spoken, never stops traveling. The first lecture of the new program took place beneath a sky that seemed to hum with early summer light, the kind that lingered softly over the city before dissolving into dusk. The hall was full. Students from half a dozen countries sat side by side, their notebooks open, their faces illuminated by a shared expectancy that Maya could feel pulsing through the air. She stood by the tall windows for a moment before beginning, letting the hush settle around her like a familiar friend. Outside, The wind carried the scent of wisteria, and the faint sound of temple bells drifted over the rooftops. When she finally spoke, her voice was low but steady, shaped by years of restraint and renewal. "Every truth," she began, "is born from an act of listening. Every lie from an act of fear." She didn't lecture that day. She told a story. Not the public version that newspapers had printed or documentaries had dramatized, but the real one. Quiet, imperfect, profoundly human. She spoke of a young waitress who once mistook silence for safety, of a lie overheard in a language she had loved since childhood, and of the moment her heart decided that integrity was worth more than comfort. Her words flowed without effort, not polished but true, each sentence a thread weaving together the long tapestry of her journey. The students listened without interruption, their pens motionless, as though afraid that writing might break the fragile spell of her honesty. When she reached the part about Kaito, her tones softened. "He was not a villain," she said quietly, "just a man who forgot that power built on deceit is only a shadow of success. And I," she paused, letting the silence breathe, "was simply the mirror that truth used to find him." A murmur passed through the room, not of judgment, but of understanding. For a moment, she felt as though time itself had circled back, allowing her to see the story from above, stripped of anger, stripped of fear, reduced to its purest form: cause, consequence, compassion. When the lecture ended, no one clapped at first. They simply sat there, absorbing what they had heard, the kind of silence that felt less like absence and more like reverence. Then, slowly, applause began to rise, not loud but deep and rhythmic, the sound of connection rather than celebration. Maya bowed her head, her eyes glistening in the soft afternoon light. She realized then that redemption was not a single moment, but an echo, one that continued to return, reshaping itself in every life it touched. After the students left, she remained in the empty hall, the air still warm with their presence. The sunset spilled across the floor like liquid amber, catching on the edges of the desks. She walked to the window, watching the city below its trains, its neon veins, its steady pulse of humanity, and felt a quiet gratitude rise in her chest. Everything had changed, and yet nothing had. The truth was still out there, moving through ordinary lives, whispered in new languages, carried by new voices. That evening, back at her apartment, she brewed tea and opened the window to let the wind wander in. The paper crane still perched beside her journal, its wings slightly yellowed with time. She reached out, unfolded it carefully for the first time, and found that the inked word Shinjitsu was still clear, still alive, as if the years had never touched it. She smiled, folded it back into shape, and placed it on the sill where the last light of day could find it. Outside, the sky deepened into twilight, the first stars trembling above the river. Maya sat by the window, her reflection merging with the fading world beyond, and whispered the words she had once spoken to herself on a cold night in New York. "Sometimes, one honest voice can destroy an empire built on lies. But now," she added softly, "and sometimes it builds something far greater in its place." The wind lifted through the room, brushing past her face, and the crane stirred as if in answer, its shadow fluttering against the wall like a living promise. The truth was still flying quiet, endless, and free.